BJ, not all the time an employer will come back to you and reject you. Sometimes you just never know what happened to that project. But if an employer is courteous enough to actually give critical feedback, how do you take that on board as a freelancer?
Well, it depends on the feedback. At times, the feedback is very clear, well, you don't have the skills. And if that is the case, and you think that the client is right, then you can either decide to drop it completely or come back with saying, well, I realize that I don't have the skills, but I'm willing to do this at a low rate, for instance. Mm-hmm. Or I see that I'm able to I'm willing to do this part of the project, and you could do it as a test assignment, and I'm willing to grow and so on. I'm willing to basically push myself further. Because at times, some employers might be looking for the very best. Some employers might be in a rush and they just want one. Yeah. And you could be lucky that the employer might just see your reply coming up and go, well, I didn't expect this. And it's also an opportunity for you, if you're being rejected, to come up with a counter proposal. It's very often easy to immediately assume that because someone is putting up a project that you have to abide by those rules. Well, it's an opportunity to come back with a counter proposal. For instance, if a project is relatively wide, you might say, well, fair enough, I'm not able to do that, but I'm able to do that bit. And I think I'm able to do that bit substantially cheaper than what you need, or you might come up with a counter proposal. I think that can be done differently, and so on. Mm-hmm. You have nothing to lose. If someone has already rejected you, it's an opportunity to come back with a better response, with a better answer. Now, in the likelihood that you do have the skills, and the rejection might be due to, for instance, the price being too high and so on, just put in a new proposal. When I reject applicants, I barely remember the name. When it's the new application, I've rejected another 40 today. So it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to be able to remember you. Okay. So it's an opportunity for you to get back better.
So if someone gets back to you and rejects you, and you disagree with their statement that they think you don't have the skills, then what? You do the counter proposal? How do you stamp your feet and get really mad at them? How do you craft back a counter argument?
Try to think of evidence. Like, just arguing isn't really going to cut it. The best arguments you can have is evidence. The profiles that I end up going for, I'm usually won over within a couple of sentences of the profile. And then I start looking at the evidence. And the biggest evidence that I can find is the feedback that is given by other employers.
Okay.
And then after that, I start looking at portfolio, and then I start looking at test scores. Like one testimonial I read today, the employer was so happy with the freelance that I said, I hope one day I'm able to fly to India and shake this man's hand for the work that he's done for me. Okay. That's a good testimony.
Yeah, absolutely. So if someone does come back to you and say you don't have the skills, and you're convinced that you do have the skills, it could be a problem with your image or the way you communicated those skills. Is that right?
It could be. I mean, often a lot of profiles tend to be really low on evidence, and at times it's almost laughable because the profile description on Odesk, for instance, might not include any evidence. You might just say, well, I do this type of work and I do that type of work, which is very boring to read. Because if you read 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 applications and it's just, I do that type of work, and it doesn't contain any actual evidence of it, mm-hmm. then there's little reason for me to actually read the rest. A very clear example of that I reviewed a couple of weeks ago is a freelancer who had 2 university degrees in addition to relevant industry experience, and nowhere in the profile description did she mention it. And it was just all the way down the bottom. And I said, well, you got always great arguments, you're not using them. And it's really sad because usually when I'm looking through a freelance profile, it takes me seconds to evaluate whether or not this is a good or a bad freelancer. And the way that a freelancer sells himself can also be an indication of their work, particularly if they're in a sales type of job. if they're doing copywriting, for instance.